I'm going to be talking about my work at Tell-Hibeh that began in 2003. And the title of the presentation is Salt of the Earth, Christian Mummification Practices in Byzantine Egypt, the Evidence from Tell-Hibeh. And this is a slideshow that was originally prepared for my intro students. So, of course, mostly what they know about Egypt has to do with either King Tut, hence Howard Carter here, or the pyramids of Giza. So I can forego that. Of course, one of my areas that I became interested in before going to Egypt was the Roman occupation of Egypt, and in particular, the melding of traditional Egyptian iconography and belief systems with some traditional Roman features. Like we see here, we've got an image of the god Horus, or at least the head of the god Horus, and it's the body of the individual is in full military regalia, Roman military regalia. So this dates from first century AD. And the first season that I began working at Tell-Hibeh, and I get involved simply serendipitously. I'd never worked in Egypt before. I spent 25 years of my career doing prehistoric anthropological archaeology in Western North America. So Egypt hadn't really even entered into my view, other than it seemed like it'd be an interesting place to work sometime. And a colleague of mine with whom I'd worked closely over the years had worked at this project with the UC Berkeley team at Tell-Hibeh. And she said, "Robert, you have to work on this project. You just have to. It's the most amazing thing you'll ever see." And I was sure it was interesting, but I didn't have her level of enthusiasm at that point. But I figured, oh, I'll give it a try. I'll expand my horizons a bit. And so I contacted the project director, who was Carol Redmount, who at the time was the chair of Near Eastern Studies and also the curator of Egyptian archaeology at the Hearst Museum at UC Berkeley. And she asked me what I did. And I said, well, I'm a zooarchaeologist. And she said, well, gee, that's great, because we don't have anyone to do zooarch. What else can you do? I said, well, I'm a lithics person as well. She says, wow, fantastic. We don't have anyone to do lithics, and we've got lots of flint here. And I said, I also do human osteology. She said, wow, fantastic. We don't have an osteologist. So in general, I got brought in, and within the first few days, I made myself extremely useful, and they decided they liked me. And after about the second day, I decided that I was in love with Egypt, with the people, with the archaeology, with the landscape. It hit me. It was magical. And so this marks my 20th year of working on the Tell-Hibeh project. And the image you see on the slide here is the existing Coptic church at a small monastery in Beni Suef called the Dir al-Bayad. And it's a fascinating, it was the first Coptic monastery I'd ever been exposed to. And we spent the entire season there. But what makes this particular church extremely interesting is that the two stone pillars that you can see at the entrance were erected there in about AD, between AD 550 and 600. So right before, still during Byzantine times, and just before the the Arab incursion. So that was inspirational to me. And one of the interesting things that I discovered early on before I began doing much digging was that mummification was something that had been pretty much banned in Egypt beginning in about the 4th century AD. And there were two major proponents who caused that to happen. And one was St. Anthony the Great of Egypt, the founder of monasticism. And he believed that pagan burial practices that included mummification were truly evil and should be completely abandoned, and anyone that practiced them were, basically going straight to hell. So he was one influence, and the other was the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who was extremely zealous in his Christianity, and he too forbade the practice of mummification in Egypt. So the expectation would be that any time after the mid or even the beginning of the 4th century AD, you wouldn't expect to see any evidence of mummification, just based on the history. But it turned out to be not the case. At least the archaeology would show, and I would discover over the course of the next few years. I bring this image up because I find it fascinating that even in this 17th century panel that we see on the right, we see imagery of these dog-faced saints. And these dog-faced saints look remarkably like Anubis, who is on a Ptolemaic panel that's on the left. So a lot of the belief systems and symbology from pagan Egypt found their way into certain aspects of Coptic Christianity. So the site in question, for most of you probably haven't even heard of El-Hibeh. Its Egyptian or ancient Egyptian name is Teudjoi, and Teudjoi is Egyptian for their walls, or if you're to use Sahidic Coptic, the Sahidic Coptic equivalent is their walls. And this is a view south towards the North Gate. That big gap in the center between the two mounded areas is the North Gate, and the mounded area on the left is part of the North Wall, as is the part on the right. There's a couple of citadels there that have since become significantly diminished with time. But when we take a look at some of the maps here in a moment, they'll be a little more obvious. So again, since I prepare this for my students, I teach world archaeology, and I also teach a course in Egyptian archaeology. And it's unfortunate, but since they stopped teaching geography in the schools, nobody knows where anything is. So I literally have to show people where Africa is, and then where in Africa that Egypt is. And the scary thing is that most of my college students don't know that Egypt is in Africa. So what more can I say? I'll leave it at that. But the site it's in an interesting location because it's essentially, in antiquity, it would be considered to be on the edge of the frontier between Upper and Lower Egypt. And it's south of the Fayoum, and it's in, as I said, in antiquity, it would have been placed there specifically with the thought in mind that it would be a fortress, and that fortress would keep potential forces from Lower Egypt from invading the frontiers of Upper Egypt. So that's one of the reasons that the walls of Teudjoi are so thick at the north end, because if there were going to be any shenanigans, it was probably going to be from the north. Unfortunately, they didn't take that into consideration during the 25th dynasty, and of course, they were invaded from Nubia from the south, and El-Hibeh was overtaken quite easily. But you can see by its location, it's just north of Elminia and about 35 miles south of Beni Suef. And its location is, right next to the Nile. You can see in this satellite image that the tell itself, I tell my students that it looks like a piece of pizza that someone has taken a bite out of the edge of the upper part of the crust. So the northeastern part of the wall area looks like someone took a bite out of the edge of the crust of the pizza, and then it literally ends at the tip of a triangle here at the south end. So it's quite triangular in shape. And the area surrounding it is covered with tens of thousands of shaft tombs. Unfortunately, most of them have been severely looted, and a lot of that looting intensified during the Arab Spring. And one of the nightmares about working at El-Hibeh post-Arab Spring was that it was commandeered by a band of armed looters in 2011, and we didn't get access to the tell again until 2017. So, and there was such a great degree of damage. I don't have time to go into it, but very demoralizing. And we spent literally the entire 2017 season assessing the damage that had been done. And we didn't even complete the work during that entire season. But here's another image that focuses in a little more clearly on the tell itself, and all the areas that have designations with abbreviations are areas in which we have done excavation. So you get the idea right away that we haven't even scratched the surface on this site. And technically we've been working there since 2001, but we missed literally a 12-year, 13-year period following the Arab Spring, unfortunately. So the work that you see here was done mostly between 2001 and 2007. And if we take a look at this isometric contour map of the tell, you can tell where the towers were, because that's where the greatest areas of elevation have to have been. And again, you also get the notion that the walls are at their greatest height and thickness towards the north end, but also on the eastern side. And that makes sense, because there would have been, if one were to invade from the eastern desert, the eastern area would have been vulnerable if the walls weren't thick there. And the walls are literally, best we can tell, 70 feet tall and up to 30 feet in thickness, and would have been mud brick covered with stucco and then plaster. And again, the areas that are designated, you can see the north gate. The area that says temple is important because the site was initially, the temple was dedicated to Shoshank I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty. And a lot of his imagery and the temple itself, the god is Amun of the great roarings. And of course, this is during that period of Egyptian history where Theban priests, the high priests of Amun in Thebes, have a great deal of influence throughout Egypt. And that is reflected with the choice of the god, with the dedication of the temple. And just another view of Teudjoi, view south, showing just how massive those walls are. And you can't really appreciate just how massive they are until you're up on them and then get on top and see just how thick the walls are. And from a distance, it looks like a natural feature, almost looks like you've got an eroded hillside. But when you get up close, you can see the individual mud bricks. And many of these mud bricks are impressed with cartouches that contain the names of high priests of Amun who were responsible for the construction of the Tell, or the walls around the Tell, that, based on what we can tell so far, began around the 10th century BCE. Now, this is a very bad reconstruction. This was done by the Discovery Channel in 2007. The Discovery Channel found out about one of my Coptic mummies that had been murdered, and so that made them interested, and they had a program called The Bone Detective. So they came out in 2007 and dedicated an episode to one of the mummies that I was working on, one of the Coptic Byzantine mummies, NGLP-7. We'll meet here in a few minutes, but they kind of got, the interior is okay, but the walls are way too thin, and the north gate is completely wrong. But they were trying to just give people a general idea of what a town like El-Hibeh might have looked like. So yeah, in general, it gives you an idea, but it's not accurate for Teudjoi at all. And in fact, you can see there's a village of El-Ugra, which is just to the north. And the buildings, some of them which are made from mud brick in very much the same way as the ancient structures at El-Hibeh, they eerily look pretty much the same as those buildings would have looked several thousand years ago within the walls of El-Hibeh. And you can see a few of them in the background. And this is literally just about a mile north of the site. So this is a part of the slide presentation that Dr. Redmount put together that, introduces why is El-Hibeh important? Because we don't know anything to speak of about the Third Intermediate period. And most of what's out there that has been written is really outdated. And what we've uncovered so far at El-Hibeh doesn't support a lot of what is considered to be, literally gospel for the Third Intermediate period. But the Third Intermediate period in this part of Egypt in particular is completely unknown. So this site really is key to understanding the Third Intermediate period in a part of Egypt that is understudied. And we have to remember that the site wasn't even established until the beginning of the Third Intermediate period. So it was fairly intensively occupied clear up through the Byzantine period. And then by the time of the Arab incursion in the 7th century AD or CE, it was pretty much had been abandoned. And the archaeology supports that. And the whole point of Dr. Redmount picking the concession for El-Hibeh was so that she'd have a project for graduate students, Berkeley graduate students, for the next several decades. And we're already working into our third decade. And as I said, we haven't even really scratched the surface yet. But so it has a great educational function, as well as cultural resource management. We're trying to preserve the site as much as possible, although because of the revolution in 2011, all of our energies towards that pretty much fell apart. And we're back to square one in that regard, unfortunately. One of the things that we do have that most digs don't, and I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, is we've got a 7,500 square foot, 4-story villa that's right on the Nile. And over the years, we've been able to put air conditioning on all the sleeping rooms. And the infrastructure that we've developed there really has made it comfortable for students and also to be able to work out at the site. One of the difficulties that those of you that work in Egypt will understand is that we can't take any of the materials off site, not even back to our villa. We have lab space at the villa, but we can't even use it because we can't take anything off site across the Nile, even though we could take it back the very next day. So one of the things that we had to do with a considerable amount of funding, I mean, we've invested probably close to $1 million over the last 20 years just getting things set up at Hibeh, including not only the villa, which is literally 2 blocks from the ferry, and it's the only ferry for 100 miles in either direction. So it's it's a strategic spot. So it takes us like 3 minutes to get to the ferry, and depending on what time the guys get up to run the ferry, we can generally be across the Nile and to the site by 5:30 or 6 in the morning, which during the summers when we have to work there is really essential to get there when it's as cool as possible. And even at 6 in the morning, it's 95 degrees. So one of the things that we had to do, of course, was build infrastructure that's almost on the site. We're not literally on the site, but we're within about a quarter of a mile of the site. So we're just on the edge of the village of El-Hibeh. And we made a lot of friends in the village because we brought water and electricity to a part of the village that never had water and electricity before, potable water and electricity, because we needed that in order to run our labs and our storage facilities. Plus the end that you see here with the vehicles is where the site guards live. So, and we also they wanted a Turkish toilet, so we built them a Turkish toilet, and we built ourselves the luxury of a European style toilet. So we have a European style bathroom that's available on the site, because before we built that, we had to go out into the desert and, find a looter pit to do our business in. And that wasn't the best of situations, especially with all the feral dogs running around. So that was a big plus. And plus our labs, this is my osteology lab, and I do both the human stuff as well as the zooarch stuff in this. It's not a huge space, but the most important thing about it is it has an air conditioning unit in it. So when it's 125 degrees out, it can be 75 degrees in my lab space, and that's a happy place to be. The other caravan that we have that's also used for lab space, primarily for cataloging, is just across from my lab. And then the majority of the building is either used for storing our field equipment or our artifacts. For a long time, we didn't have any place on site to store the artifacts, so we had to send them to a facility on the other side of Beni, Suef, that was over 40 miles away. So it was really a big pain in the butt to try to get any work done and have access to the artifacts. So now, as long as we're on the site, we have access to work on the artifacts. The Shashank Temple, what is left of it? Now, there was more left of it when the University of Heidelberg visited El-Hibeh in 1914 and did some excavation work there. To just give you a very quick rundown on the history of work at Hibeh, it's been very spotty and very minimal. In 1901, the papyrologists Grenfell and Hunt visited the site and pretty much I hate to say it, but pretty much looted it for mummies because they were getting the cartonnage, because the cartonnage, the paper cartonnage made from the papyrus was recycled text. I mean, there were tax receipts and census records and all sorts of really important papyrological information, but it was incorporated in the cartonnage covering of some of the late period mummies. And the other downside to that is that they removed the cartonnage very carefully, and then they threw the bodies off to the side somewhere. So in terms of bioarchaeological information, we got nothing out of that. Got a lot of great documents, but so the next real true archaeological project was undertaken by the University of Heidelberg in 1914. And they focused most of their work on the Shashank Temple and recovered a number of very nice reliefs there. They also did some excavations on top of the Tell, found a bunch of nice coffins, which are now at the University of Heidelberg. And in fact, here is a panel that was collected in 1914 by the University of Heidelberg, and it has both Shashank's throne name and his birth name. So the second one, Hedge-Keferre, is his birth name. And then here's an image of Shashank the First and his wife. This was taken to the University of Heidelberg as well. And it's good that they took this material because the looting has been so horrendous at this site, even since, probably since the 1890s. And in fact, it was from looters that Grenfell and Hunt found out about the papyrus documents. And of course, El-Hibeh, speaking of papyrus documents, this is where the tale of Ween Amun came from, and the petition of Petiers. Those came from this site. So this site is well known for its important papyrus documents, particularly those two. And this is just a view from the back of the temple looking west towards the Nile. And you can see there's a lot of agricultural incursion right up to the site. And at the south end, it's literally within 5 meters of the Tell. So, and that's caused some issues with the water level, which has caused some issues with the temple in terms of exfoliation of the limestone blocks. Reconstruction of the Shashank Temple based on the work done by the University of Heidelberg, and this is a 1915 reconstruction based on the 1914 work. And then this is the most recent reconstruction, 2017, and you can go to the website. This is a Egyptologist. Egyptologist from Canada who's done this work.
That's a little,
and you can,
little under 6.5, but I thought I'd check.
Somebody's talking in the background and I'm being interrupted here.
I think that's
Is
perfect.
that still tight? Or?
No, it's not. It's like perfect.
Hello, somebody's interrupted. Hello.
It's probably come down. I mean, in a
can you please mute your
months.
phone?
Yeah. So I think
Somebody's
that would
phone
be good.
is interrupting
I think
me.
that's,
Yeah.
it still looks like it goes on.
It goes on perfect
Pretty
because I don't
easily.
even have to.
Excuse
And
me.
it's not going to fly off.
No.
Whoever
Yeah,
can
my
is,
fingers go down
mute
a
your
little bit.
phone.
Because it's just a little under 6.5.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm going to stop until somebody mutes their damn phone.
Robert, you have control.
Thank you.
If you can hover over Ken's
I'm
iPhone,
on a
you
Zoom.
can
I
mute.
cannot. Yeah,
I hope I'm not.
Ken's, can you please mute your iPhone? You are interrupting the lecture.
Okay. Seems quieter now.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay. It happens. I have the same problem with students. So anyway, there's a website that you can go to. This is an Egyptologist who's in Canada, and you can do a virtual tour through the Shashank Temple now. It's actually very well done. So some of the areas in which we did some test excavations early on, we didn't expect to find any architecture. And this is one of those areas. The reason we expected not to find any architecture is it wasn't on the Tell. And one of the reasons for people living on the Tell was that it was above the flood zone. So you would think that if you're in the flood zone, you're not going to find any architecture. But that's why we test excavate, because there was lots of architecture, as it turned out, in this particular area, which is on the northwestern side of the Tell. So, and you can see inside this room that we've excavated a large water jar that was found in C2. And of course, we collected all the soil inside for special flotation and other analyses. But most of the standing architecture that is on top of the Tell is from the area that we call Roman Town. The reason we call it Roman Town is it was the last part of the Tell that was occupied up through Byzantine times. And the buildings that you see here, some of them were investigated in the 1930s by a group of Italian archaeologists, and they found a number of papyrus documents as well as several caches of coins from the Ptolemaic period. During the investigations done by the University of Heidelberg on top of the Tell, I mentioned that they did encounter a number of burials, and here are some of to give you an idea of just the high quality of the wooden coffins and sarcophagi that existed at the Tell, and I'm sure still exist in some areas that we haven't had a chance to investigate yet, including stone sarcophagi. These are primarily from the late period, so between about 664 and 332 BCE. And you can see a nice gilded cartonnage mummy that's inside this stone sarcophagus, and the lid has been removed. That lid off to the upper right-hand corner was from this particular sarcophagus. But most of the work, as I said, that was done very early on by Grenfell and Hunt was because there was a lot of recycling of papyrus documents. And we see a good example of some cartonnage from the exterior of a mummy, and you can see some plaster and some painting, but you can also see some text underneath all that. And on the back of this same piece, you can see more text. So with careful use of water and tweezers, you can remove these documents. It causes the destruction of the cartonnage, unfortunately, but the early papyrologists were not terribly concerned about that. They were more concerned about the documents. And as I said, probably one of the two most important documents that came from this site are the Petition of Petiers and the Tale of Wien Amun. And there's an image of one of the pages of the Tale of Wien Amun. And there was an ongoing challenge that anyone who found the last few pages of the Tale of Wien Amun, since we don't know how it ended, would get a couple of cases of Sakara, which is one of the beers that's available in Egypt. one of two beers that's available in Egypt. So this is also one of the places where you get, among the burials, the Roman burials, this is within that region where you get the Fayum mummy portraits. And the two Roman mummies on the left were excavated by Grenfell and Hunt in the 1901, and they both ended up going to the British Museum. And the young lady on the right, whose name is Isadora, she's currently on display at the Getty Villa in Malibu. So if you ever get a chance to get out to California and visit the Getty Villa, where all the antiquities are on display, this is in the Egypt room. And because of her hairstyle and the jewelry she's wearing, we know that she died somewhere around AD 114 to 120. So pretty accurate dating just because of the hairstyle and the jewelry that she's wearing. Beautiful encaustic painting. The conservation work was very good, but this particular specimen was in great shape to begin with. So in 2003, I began my reconnaissance work, trying to figure out the areas that needed the most attention in terms of human material. And one of these areas was Burial Cave 1, or BC1. It's actually a limestone solution cave. It's small, but it was culturally modified. People realized that, hey, this would make a great tomb. So they went in with bronze picks and chisels, and chiseled, flattened off the roof and the back of the interior, and it was used for a tomb for a long period of time. Based on the archaeology that we managed to get out of this cave in terms of cultural materials, seems like it was used up until about the 4th century AD. This is the unfortunate part, though. It shows you just how bad the looting is. When Dr. Redmount was there in 2002, this was inside of BC1, and you see actually one full intact mummy and another smaller mummy in the back. Turns out it's a child mummy. And then there's an actual mummified arm. And all three of these were in perfect condition in 2002. When I showed up in 2003, this is what they looked like. The adult mummy had been torn apart except for the lower limbs. And the child mummy had been completely destroyed. The head, the wrappings of the head were still intact, but someone had actually smashed it with their foot. So there were skull fragments and hair fragments, but just an example of the degradation that was going on even before the Arab Spring. And then by the time in 2003, even though we had this problem with the mummies that were obvious, I recorded 4 mummies that were in back of the cave that were still intact. So 2004, my job was to come and get those 4 intact mummies. Well, when I got there in 2004, they weren't intact. This is what they looked like. And all of them had their heads and hands cut away. The rest of them was pretty much there, but heads and hands sell, they're black market sites on the dark web where you can get a mummified human head for $30,000. So you can see why why looters would, do that sort of desecration, unfortunately. So we were able to try to figure out what was looted and what areas might still be intact. And this is an image from the inside. And some of the materials, we screened everything through all the soils that we excavated through very fine mesh screens. So we got a number of amulets. We got a nice bone scarab and faience wadjet, still with the string in the hole. We've got strung faience beads, as well as a bunch of wide variety of faience beads that were loose. And a late Roman coin. This is a 4th century Roman coin that seems to be the latest artifact from the interior. And we believe it's Constantius Gallus, so dates to AD 350 to 353 or thereabouts. And this would probably be one of the earlier pieces. This is a Ptolemaic mummy mask, a complete one on the right. The one that we recovered was made from mud stucco and then covered with plaster and painted. And then, unfortunately, like everything else in the tomb, terribly damaged. And then this was the 2004 crew, Dr. Jill Gardner there to my right, and 2 of our students in the background there. And you can see the chisel marks on the ceiling very clearly. This was, I assumed that this might be a single family tomb that was looted. We called this SKU1. I did the collection here in 2003, and they were once mummies. And as it turns out, they were Byzantine burials. And we, based on the pottery that was associated with the remains, and here's some of the pottery in the lower left-hand corner, they were all used in a period between 400 and 500 CE, or so it's very, very tightly datable. And 16 individuals, a minimum of 16 individuals, ranging in age from 12 years old all the way up to older than 55. And most of the individuals were between the ages of 20 and 30, which is fairly typical of the human remains that I've worked with in Egypt. And I've worked with a couple of hundred individuals, if not more. They all appear to be between, like I said, 20 and 30. 25 seems to be the mean. Life was tough in ancient Egypt. Now, NGLP is one of the most important locations because this is where we started to find the Coptic mummies that were eroding out. So initially we thought it was just a big looter pit, but it turns out that it matches almost perfectly the notes from Grenfell and Hunt. They talk about digging this hole outside the front part of the north gate, and they were looking for older burials, and all they could find were these Byzantine bodies that looked just like the ones that had been found in Karanis by the University of Heidelberg, and by other folks who had excavated in the area. So they recognized them as being Byzantine. And of course, they weren't interested because there wasn't any papyrus or any grave goods with these Byzantine bodies. So in 2003, this is what I was seeing, the ends of these Coptic burials that were extending out of the, eroding out of the edge of the hole that had been dug by Grenfell and Hunt in probably 1901. And when we started the full-on excavation, we found that we had literally trenches with bodies piled on top of one another. In this trench here, we had 4 mummies that were piled on top of each other, and they had been buried very quickly. I mean, it was obviously a lot of dead bodies at one time, and there were 2 trenches. Both of these trenches were dug in a 2nd century CE Roman trash deposit. So we knew that it post-dated that Roman trash deposit, and I estimated between the 4th and 6th centuries AD. And this is NGLP-1, and you can see the part that was extending out and eroding because that's where all the damage is here at the distal end of the body. But you'll notice the interesting wrapping around the facial area, and also the facial projection, very strange and very specific to these Byzantine mummies. Here's another one. And in addition to having this facial projection, it has this rattan ring that's placed around it. The thing that was very odd about these bodies is that they seemed way too heavy, because if you're used to working with human remains, even mummified bodies are very light. And this individual, for example, who was one of our bigger guys, he was close to 6 feet tall. He weighed over 100 pounds, and that's even with a lot of wrapping, that's still pretty heavy for a mummy. So we found out what the problem was, or why they were so heavy in the next year. Anyway, here's some of the other NGLP-3 and NGLP-4, and you'll notice that they look strikingly like the mummies that were excavated at Carrara by the University of Heidelberg archaeologists. Same ones that worked at Hibeh went to this site called Carrara, which was a Coptic burial ground 30 miles south of El-Hibeh, and looked pretty much the same. So in 2000, and this is just a view from our villa across the Nile, and what you're seeing is air pollution, the wonderful air pollution of Egypt. It's even in Middle Egypt, unfortunately. And part of the problem is that there's no formal trash disposal, so everyone burns their trash. So in 2005, we continued our excavations to try to remove those bodies that were most endangered. We weren't worried about the ones that were well buried, but we were worried about the ones that were sticking out and people could see that there were bodies there. So in 2005, we excavated NGLP-7 and NGLP-8. Here's the 2005. You can see the bodies. All the ones that are dark are ones that we removed in 2004 in the 2 separate trenches. And then the 2 stippled bodies, NGLP-7 and NGLP-8, were removed in 2005. And then the other mummies have not, the ones that you see here were noted, but had not been removed, in part because at this time we did not have an appropriate place to store them. So, and then here's just a profile NGL-7, NGLP-7 and NGLP-8. Now, NGLP stands for North Gate Looter Pit. So that's where we got that designation. And what's interesting is that all of these pieces of limestone block were exported from the temple. The temple was clearly destroyed by the Coptic Christians, and they took the destroyed parts of the temple and they brought it to this area where the cemetery was and covered the bodies. And then on top of the blocks, they put a cap of mud brick. So this is NGLP-7 before we removed it. And then this is, the reason I'm wearing a mask, by the way, is that one thing that people who haven't worked with mummies probably don't realize is that they have a very strong odor. They smell like a combination of roadkill and incense, because most of these bodies had been covered with resin, and so they have that myrrh, frankincense kind of aroma, but it's mixed with the smell of slightly funky decomposing dry tissue. So it's not terribly, I mean, you get accustomed to it, but that's why I'm wearing a charcoal mask. And we found that the easiest way to clean the mummies was to use a vacuum cleaner. Worked great. And especially when we're trying to preserve these cords, these cords seem to be very typical of between the 2nd century and 5th century CE, various colors. We've got some that are a combination of black and tan, as well as red. In 2006, we had the good fortune of my friend and colleague, Salima Ikram from the American University in Cairo, has a portable X-ray machine. So she brought it to the site while we were not on site. It didn't work out that we were there at the same time. So she went to the site and X-rayed all of our Coptic mummies. And what's interesting is, hey, wait a minute, we're not seeing any bone. There's something wrong here. There's something that's obstructing the bone. And it turns out that it was natron. These bodies were being packed in salt. And it wasn't until 2005 and 2006 that we got the permission to do a necropsy on a couple of the NGLP-7 and NGLP-8. So this is NGLP-7, and this is Dr. Gardner and I. As I'm starting, I decided the best way to do this, rather than do a traditional unwrap, was to make a single incision so that I could pick the wrapping up like a lid, so that I didn't damage the exterior too much. And then when I was done, I could put it back down like a lid. So that actually worked out pretty well. And the first thing I see here as I'm cutting with the scalpel is, hey, there's natron. In fact, I can't see any soft tissue or bone. It's all salt. And it worked really good in terms of preservation. You can see we've got a nicely preserved right eye here, and a lot of the soft tissue on the right side of the face, as well as the musculature on the neck. And you can see massive, it turns out that there was over 70 kilograms of natron that they packed this body in. The other thing that was interesting is that the body was buried nude. So, and on top of being nude, the body had been treated with resin. So nude body, treated with resin, and packed in natron. What does that sound like? Well, by this thinking, this is the 4th century, the first thing that came to my mind was they're trying to do mummification without doing mummification, because typical mummification generally took between 70 and 120 days. And of course, with Christianity, you want to try to get the bodies into the ground within 3 days. So mummification is not going to work unless you do exactly what these people did, and that is treat the naked body with resin and pack them in natron. And it worked wonderfully. And for those that don't know, natron is primarily sodium carbonate, and it has a wonderful property of desiccating soft tissue. So it literally turns it to jerky in a relatively short period of time. It's what the ancient Egyptians used for thousands of years for more formal mummification, but they figured it out fairly early on because bodies that were buried in natron-rich soil tended to preserve really well. So they picked it up from that, hey, if we use natron, we can dry these bodies out and they'll last a lot longer. So you can see that the soft tissue on the neck and the back are really well preserved, as well as ringlets of hair. The length of this guy's hair, maximum length is about 10 centimeters. So he had these locks on the top of his head. But he also had this rather impressive impact fracture, and it was oblong. And I thought, what is that? And you can see a nice radiating fracture coming out of it. It was the back of his head. So the first thing that came to mind, it's the wrong size for it to be a mace. So sling bullet. And there's another view. You can see that's a pretty, and that's peri-mortem. That's not a post-mortem injury that happened right about the time of death. And this was likely the cause of death. And there's no evidence of any healing. And yep, there's a sling bullet made out of lead, perfect size. So, and we did some experimentation, and it seems that, yeah, sling bullet is probably the best interpretation of what happened to this guy, which suggested he was running away and someone, ended up hitting him in the back of the head with a sling bullet. And that and some other injuries that we see in the x-rays indicated that there may have been an attack on the Tell during the time when all of these guys were buried en masse. And I'm just there. This is the side of the head that is not as well preserved, but you can still see the musculature of the neck and the torso are in pretty good shape. And the ringlets of hair are pretty consistent with what we see with the hairstyles for males during this same general time period. These are from the 2nd to 4th centuries AD for the most part. And for the Bone Detectives episode that the Discovery Channel did, they brought in a forensic artist to do a reconstruction of NGLP-7, and this is what he came up with, which isn't that much different from what we see with some of our Fayum mummy portraits. So, as we would expect. So, he was between 20 and 30 years old when he died. He had short, curly black hair, was between 5'6" and 5'8" in terms of stature, average build, buried naked after being treated with resins, then packed in natron. He had very serious, my good friend Keith Corver, who was a cardiothoracic surgeon, he accompanied me in 2007 and brought an endoscope. And so we did some endoscopic work with the body, and we were able to look at the liver. What was amazing is that the internal organs were amazingly well preserved. Normally during Roman times, they didn't remove the organs and they generally decomposed. But I think since these bodies were buried so quickly and they were packed in natron, it led to the preservation of the organs that you might not ordinarily get. And the liver still had, there were cysts on it that were probably related to schistosomiasis, and had some severe pulmonary issues. Keith said that it looked to him like someone who had been smoking cigarettes 3 packs a day for 45 years. And he would know because he's done a lot of heart and lung transplants. So, which seemed interesting for someone so young. So he must have been working in some industry where he was exposed to massive quantities of smoke over a long period of time. And we also know that he was apparently murdered. So that is interesting. NGLP-8 appears to be in a later burial, and he also was treated differently. He had been looted, so he was literally cut in half. So we only have the upper part of the torso. And here's NGLP-8 in situ, and you can see the rope. The rope that was used to lower him into the burial pit was still present. And this stone that's looks like a headstone, when we remove the dirt around it, it's actually a piece from the Shashank temple. And here's an image of Shashank the First, complete with his pharaonic beard and flail and some hieroglyphic text. So that is probably one of the coolest dynastic archaeological discoveries I've ever made. And it was completely unexpected because it was mixed in with this Byzantine burial. So one of my graduate students, Deanna Heikkinen, she took this on as her pet project. And unlike the earlier burials in the other two trenches that have 5 or 6 different layers of flax linen surrounding their bodies, this guy only had a couple of layers, and his face didn't have that projection, and he wasn't packed in natron. All of these bodies, interestingly, had these palm frond ribs that are called jarids in Arabic for stabilizing the body, because these bodies were limp. Once rigor mortis goes away, which is pretty quickly, then the body becomes limp again. So in order to keep the bodies stiff, because they're not mummified at this point, you need to put something substantial underneath. So they lash these jarids together the full length of the body, and then they put the body on top, and then they would include the jarids in the wrapping, and they wrap the body. So what was interesting about this fellow is that he had what we would call a ritual sprinkling of natron over the top of his body, and the only parts of his body that didn't skeletonize was the skin on his upper torso and his buttocks. Everything else was skeletonized except for one of his hands. So he was also wrapped in 3 tunics, which was really interesting, because the tunics, here's one of the tunics, stained with body fluids, but also with a number of decorations on it. You can see, and here's a second tunic, and then there's a third tunic, and they're all slightly different. They have patches of embroidery. They've got, this one has clavi on it, which are these decorative features that go over the shoulders that are kind of a remnant of Roman military regalia. It was incorporated into Coptic design. Here's a close-up view of some of the decorations, and some more. You can see the patchwork there. And then here's the distal, or the end of one of these clavi, clavus singular. And then we've got some creatures here. I'm not exactly sure if they're birds or some kind of running animal. But then we have some nicely colored patches as well. It shows the preservation of color and in the soils here. And then images of the peacock. And the peacock is significant because in Christianity, it's a symbol of resurrection. So this particular tunic had multiple peacock decorations on it. And here we can see a peacock, as well as a plant, some kind of vine plant with fruiting ends on them. We don't know what the fruit is, but very interesting design elements. And then this is what we had of the body. And between the teeth and the sternal ends of the ribs, this guy was young. This guy was between 17 and 19 years old when he died. And yet he showed evidence of having done a lot of hard labor, because he had schmurl nodes on his lumbar vertebrae on the vertebral bodies. So that's indicative of herniated discs. Multiple herniated discs when you're 17 and 19 is not a common thing. So what do we know about him? He was young, between 17 and 19. He also had cribra orbitalia, which is really common in Egypt because of anemia associated with schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis is endemic to this day in Egypt. About 20% of the population still have the parasitic infection. And of course, the parasite the female lays her eggs in the bladder. So there are a lot of urological problems that result from this disease. And one of them, of course, is urinating blood. In fact, the urination of blood by males was so common in ancient Egypt that it was considered that males had their own form of menses like females. So, which was one of those interesting factoids that you don't hear a lot about. But that was due to schistosomiasis. That's just how commonplace schistosomiasis was. And in younger people, it will express itself as porosity in the upper part of the eye orbits. So this guy, compared to the earlier bodies, didn't have much natron. I mean, maybe a couple of handfuls, that was it. And the body was also wrapped in 3 tunics in addition to the simple linen shroud, and only had a simple gauze pad over the face. Now, those other older Byzantine mummies had this complex structure built over their faces that was made out of palm fronds and stuffed with grass. So something very different from what we found with this later burial. So, and just based on what we were seeing, we thought that it post-dated our other bodies by between 150 and 200 years. So what we thought we were seeing here, and I still believe is the case, is the evolution of Coptic burial techniques from something that is more akin to earlier mummification to something that becomes more highly ritualized. And there's not as much, the natron becomes a ritual function rather than having the practical function of preserving the entire body. So the NGLP burials, my interpretation at this point is they're seeing the transition from paganism to Christianity. And so we're looking at perhaps evidence of the evolution of burial practices from Christian Roman Egypt to just before the time of the Arab conquest. So between AD 250 and AD 640 or thereabouts. But then we get weird things like this, and I'm still not, this body I have to come back to and do an autopsy on, because that cranium, that is not dried brain. That is either resin or asphaltum. And if that's the case, then there's something else going on here that is far more complex than just dousing the body with resin and then packing it in natron. So this is a very strange X-ray that needs further investigation. Anyway, I know that I've probably significantly gone over my time. There's a lot more to cover, and I think I've hit the high points, and I appreciate your patience, because I know it was a pain in the butt to have to sit through the first 15 minutes of futzing around with the technology. But if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to entertain them.
Well, that was a great presentation, Robert. We really appreciate that.
Absolutely. I mean, I've got like 40 more slides, but I know you guys have other things to do. So
you could really keep going here.
Taking upon myself to stop it here.
Okay.
But will mention that this shows just how great the preservation at the site is, because this is a coffin lid that we found inside of BC1, and you can see that there's an Anubis figure that's on it over an altar, and hieroglyphic text that's on here still. I mean, it's just, the degree of preservation is astounding. Anyway,
that's unreal. It's sort of a blessing and a curse, I'm sure, though, too, right? Because it takes forever to excavate everything.
Oh yes, absolutely.
You have to be that careful. So
absolutely, yeah. But questions?
Robert?
Yes.
Stacy here. I just wanted to find out Can you think of any other site in Egypt that even comes close to this kind of preservation, to be able to indicate, like, I guess, is your site unique
Yeah,
in this
I would say
time
it's
period?
unique. There's one that I'd love to go and work at, and I actually kind of have a connection because there are some similarities, and it's Fog El Gamoos, and it's over in the Fayoum. And BYU has been working at Fog El Gamoos for 30 years, but their approach to bioarchaeology has not been very sophisticated. Let's just put it that way. I mean, they don't always keep the bodies. They'll keep the skulls, but they won't keep the actual bodies, and that's a little disturbing. Now, they've had a new bioarchaeologist working with them over the past decade or so, and he's got his act together. So I think that there is an opportunity to, I would like to go there personally and check out what they have. I mean, I've seen some of the material and I've read, they beat us to the punch when it came to reporting on the tunics, because they found some tunics as well and they published on them. Unfortunately, the graduate student that I had that I thought was going to publish on our tunics didn't do so. So, and I haven't had time, but hopefully when I retire at the end of this academic year, that's one of the things I'll work on. But yeah, there's another site that has some similarities and also has evidence of warfare, just as we did at this site. Now, one of the things that I initially had to entertain before I got radiocarbon dates, that's the other thing I should bring up. I did get radiocarbon dates on NGLP-7 and NGLP-8. And, why did I even bother? Because they're about 200 years apart, just like we thought they were. And one is from about AD 255, and the other one is from about AD 450. So they're close. They're about what we figured. We said between the 4th and 6th centuries AD. So we came really close. So we did get those radiocarbon dates, which were helpful. They don't have radiocarbon dates from Fog El Gamoos, but they do have pretty good pottery chronology there, and so they're in pretty much the same time range we are, and they do have a fairly significant Byzantine cemetery. The other thing I would like to do would be to go to the University of Heidelberg and look at the bodies from Karanis. So I believe that they are there, and that's on my list of things to do. Other questions?
What is the future plans at the site?
Well, good that you ask. We were supposed to be there 2 months ago, and all the paperwork went through except for our security clearances. So we're still waiting our security clearances, which we will probably get, I suspect, around December, which is unfortunate because if we knew exactly when we were going to get them, then we could prepare for at least a short season in December, because we'll be on winter break then. But you just don't know. I mean, it might not be till January or April, but the point is it's going to be, unfortunately it's too late. And the summer session was going to be a big one because we had like 16 graduate students that were going to be involved, and we were we were going to be gung-ho and really get back to it. So it was disappointing. And plus I lost $5,000 in grant money. That was another disappointing aspect of it all. So, but the plan is just to continue the work whenever we can get back. I really don't know what the holdup is. And I'm not sure why the security clearances always take longer than they should. And this has happened to us before, but generally we've been able to work it out to where we were able to get into the field. But we have not been back since 2017. So we were really we were supposed to go to in 2020 and then COVID happened. And then 2021 and then COVID was still happening. So yeah, the last few years, I mean, literally ever since the Arab Spring, we've had just one case of bad luck after another. So, but the good news is that our storage facility is on site. And so when we do get a chance to get back there, we can get back to work. And one of the things that I was able to do with a grant that I got in 2006, I got a $70,000 grant from the American Research Center in Egypt. And I was able to build a mummy storage facility, the only one in Middle Egypt. It may not be particularly pretty, but it is a mummy storage facility, and it's a safe place to store our bodies. So that was one thing that we were able to accomplish that I'm really happy about. And that happier still that when the site was attacked by armed looters, one of the first things that the armed looters wanted to do was to break into our storage facility. But the citizens of El-Ugra literally prevented those guys. I mean, they took up arms against those people because they were so pleased with the way that we treated them and the fact that we brought electricity and water to a part of their village that never had it, that they weren't going to let these hoodlums mess with our stuff. And so, yeah, another great example of how great the Egyptian people are.
It's also a good example of how important it is to involve the community in what you're doing.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah.
And we've tried to do that as much as possible. And as a result, you know, we benefited from that, because I don't know what would have happened if they'd have broken in, and it would have been disastrous. So it was bad. And I mean, there's a whole other presentation about all the damage that was done on the Tell, but for another time.
Yeah, but at least the community has an investment in the work that you guys are doing.
Yes.
And
yes,
that's huge. That's huge.
And we've also made a point of keeping the Coptic community involved in terms of these remains, because ultimately, if they want them reinterred, then we'll do that. But at this point, they're interested in learning as much about their heritage and their biological heritage as we are. So they're happy for us to have those remains available for scientific study. And interestingly, the Coptic community still uses that general area for burial purposes. In fact, in 2003, we thought there were a bunch of looters out on the other side of the eastern side of the Tell. So the military ran out there with, you know, fortunately not with guns ablazing. And it turned out it was just a group of Copts who were burying one of their dead in a traditional area. And so yes, that area is still being used today by the people that, you know, whose ancestors buried folks there at NGLP.
Obviously, Robert, it's still important to them culturally.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Robert, I think that might answer one of the questions that we had in the chat. from Beth, who asks who gets the artifacts when the work is complete.
Yeah, I mean that's the when the work is complete, the ultimately, I mean everything belongs to the Egyptian people and the Egyptian government. So we're just it's serving as a placeholder right now in that storage facility. Unfortunately, the government really doesn't care all that much about the Byzantine period. And that was one of the reasons that we didn't have to worry about Zahi Hawass swooping in when the Discovery Channel showed up, because he could care less about, now if it had been golden Roman mummies, that would have been something different. But these unadorned bodies that weren't buried with any burial goods, he had no interest in. So, which was fine with us. So yeah, I mean, in fact, I find what we found far more interesting than the types of things that a lot of people get excited about. So, but ultimately, yeah, all this stuff belongs to the Egyptian government and the people of Egypt. And I don't think that the government have any problem with the Coptic community taking the remains from the Coptic cemetery and reburying them, if that's what they decide they want to do. And we're good with that.
Another question in the chat from Betsy: are the sites secured when you aren't there so that there isn't more looting?
Sort of. I know that's not a good answer, but we do have guards on the site. But the problem with guards is, well, there's this thing called bakshish. So if someone is willing to pay enough, the guards might happen to look the other direction. So that's, I hate to be pessimistic like that, but it has been a problem in the past. We're hoping it's not a problem now. But part of the problem is that not having been able to go back to the site since 2017, we don't really know what's happened there. I mean, we have a friend of ours lives in the villa, and he can sometimes go over and kind of superficially check things out, but he's not an archaeologist. So, yeah, technically it's supposed to be protected. And there is a branch of the Ministry of Antiquities in Beni Suef, and this site is under their jurisdiction. So they're supposed to come out on a fairly regular basis and check on the status of things. And supposedly, if there's been a big problem, then Carol will hear about it. And Carol hasn't heard about anything recently, so fingers crossed. But in a perfect world, yeah, all that stuff would be protected. But and we do have, typically there are 2 to 3 guards that are on the site at all times. And if they're doing their job properly, then we shouldn't have any problems. But the problem that we had when the site was commandeered by the armed looters was they were literally shooting people. I mean, there were 3 deaths associated with the Tell. One was a policeman that was shot and killed. One was a looter that was shot and killed. Actually, the 3rd death didn't involve any shooting. It was a looter who was digging an adit, digging a tunnel about 20 feet, below the deposit, and it collapsed on him. And I refrain from comment other than I don't think too many tears were shed. But he was one of the and part of the reason that we had this bunch of looters show up is that one of the last acts of desperation that Mubarak did before, to cause the revolution to be more of a mess than it was was he opened up all the prisons. And a lot of the prisoners that some of them were from El-Ugra. So they came back to their home village and they saw that, you know, there was a sign up that now pronounces there's this archaeological. That's one of the disadvantages of advertising that you've got an archaeological site there, is that if people see a sign that says there's an archaeological site here, they're going to say, well, there must be something. If the government puts a sign up here, it must be important enough for us to go dig on it. And they found that it was very lucrative. I mean, they moved a lot of dirt, destroyed a lot of tombs, and they discovered some architecture that we would never have found, but it wasn't worth the damage. Anyway, yeah, I've got all kinds of horror stories and even worse pictures. Pictures of before and after. That's the part that's really disturbing. Other questions?
Robert, I had a question on the status of the folks that were mummified. I may have missed it if you mentioned it, but you know, it seems like a lot of work. I mean, the textiles and the linens and everything that went into the actual burial. Was that a typical burial practice, or would that have represented someone from a higher status family?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. And what I found particularly intriguing is that the burials that seem to date from the 3rd century CE, each burial is unique, extremely unique. The way that the exterior is treated, the way that the face is decorated. I'm wondering if those are family traditions. There doesn't seem to be, they're not buried with any items of, you know, wealth. They're you know, strictly buried one on top of the other, but they took a great deal of care both in preparing the body, packing them in natron, and then wrapping them extremely carefully, and then preparing that rather elaborate facial projection, which I've had discussions with several of my colleagues about the purpose of that. And there's a really interesting manifestation of that kind of steeple over the face at the cemetery in Carrara that the University of Heidelberg investigated, because there was a bishop who was buried there, and that bishop was in a wooden coffin, and over his face was this elaborate steeple-like feature that it reminded me of these facial projections on the Byzantine mummies in general, except for the late ones. The later ones don't seem to have that, but the ones from the 3rd century, 3rd and 4th century definitely do. So that's certainly unique. And I think, and the same feature that's related to this bishop's coffin, he also has, there are peacocks that are painted on that sarcophagus. So again, the whole symbolism of the peacock, which interestingly enough, we didn't see the symbolism of the peacock until we got to the later burial, NGLP-8, which is the one that dated to the 5th century AD. So the short answer to your question is I'm not exactly sure, but I do think that the variability that we see is related to family traditions. And that's something that is probably worth some further exploration in Coptic literature. One of the things that I was very lucky in that we had, until he recently retired, Dr. Tim Vivian, who's not only an Episcopal vicar, but he's also a scholar, a Coptic, Latin, and ancient Greek scholar. So I took a year and a half of Coptic from him in an attempt to Sahidic Coptic, which is the earlier form of Coptic that these folks would have been familiar with. And yeah, on my list of things to do when I retire is to, follow up on that and do some more research in Coptic literature. And I have some colleagues who are far more competent than I in Sahidic Coptic, including Dr. Vivian. And we've collaborated on other projects. So.
Yeah, I think
other questions.
Yeah, that was a good answer. I think that that addressed the question that I had.
Anyone else? Well, I thank everyone for their attention. And again, my apologies for the rough start, but I think once we got going, it seemed to go okay.
Absolutely. No, that was great. And thank you for making the time to reschedule and give the presentation here in September. We really appreciate it. If you could do me a favor, could you make me